Atmospheric perspective, or pictorial depth, is caused by air particles which obscure shapes as they move back in space. To reproduce this phenomenon on a 2D surface requires illusionistic technique. Here's a Milton Avery painting with almost no pictorial depth. It feels like two triangles and a skinny rectangle on a flat 2D surface. For this painting, shallow depth was desired and was part of Milton Avery's point, which was to explore the geometric abstract nature of our world. But creating depth on a 2D surface allows artists more space to work with. The eye is able to move in and out, not just up and down. It is useful for non-representational spaces as well as representational paintings. There are several ways to increase pictorial depth. As things move towards the background, there is less value contrast, colors lighten and shift color, there's less textural detail, and there's less saturated color. This last point is especially powerful for painters, and I'll cover it in a little more detail at the very end. Both lights and darks become less pronounced the farther they move from the viewer. You can see the trees and bushes in this Chinese ink painting are far more dark in the foreground and significantly lighter in the background. In this Thomas Cole painting, the shadows in the foreground are very black, while they only move to a mid-dark in the distant mountains. The highlights also become less light in the mountains. The same is true in this Syrah. You can especially see the different levels of lights and darks in the lower foreground. You have to squint your eyes a bit to see this clearly. All becomes mid-range in the mid-upper background of the painting. For many outdoor scenes, distant objects become lighter and often shift towards blue. This is because blue color wavelengths are much longer than others in the color spectrum. For example, the mountain in this David Hockney, they lose yellow, turns bluish, and then purple as they go back in space. In terms of value, the final ridge is almost as light as the sky. Another example is from a medieval manuscript. These mountains have become very blue and very light as they recede in space. In this painting, on the right side of the background, there's a shift towards blue. On the left side of the background, it's a shift towards a yellow-orangey color because the light is a yellow-orangey. Notice each group of trees also becomes progressively lighter as they move back in space. Less detail or texture is a fairly straightforward technique. You cannot see intricacies as clearly in distant shape as you can in the foreground. In this painting, the picture on the wall is more generalized than the rest of the painting. It makes it feel like it's both a window to the outside world as well as an object in the room. This image is kind of a funny take on contemporary Daniel Boone, in that he's domesticated and neutered in this inside environment. In this less representational image, space is still achieved with detail. The objects in the lower center feel closer because of their intricacies. Also, more value contrast too. Controlling saturation is an essential technique for making space, and something that I think painting does exceptionally well. To review saturation briefly, saturation refers to brightness or dullness of a color. Full saturation cannot be mixed. They come only from the tube. Primary colors are usually the most saturated, and the more you mix colors, the less saturated they become. Very simply, more saturated colors come forward, while less saturated colors tend to push back. Both shirts in this image are kind of an orangey red, but the brighter red arm in the lower right corner appears much closer because it's much brighter than the orange on the shirt of the figure in the middle of the painting. This still life is mostly blue and orange, but the brightness of the orange wood shelf is far more saturated than the streaks of orange in the background wall. The blue on the bottles is also more saturated than the generally dull blue background colors. So this image has a lot more space than the narrow shelf implies it should. This technique also works for abstraction. Philip Guston creates a bulging, shimmering effect with the intense red area in the middle of this painting. Likewise, Hans Hofmann pushes the red on the right forward because of saturated. The red on the left is far less saturated and tends to fall back. Well, this piece actually accurately depicts a believable scene. The artist has intentionally reversed the saturation. Notice the water has become less saturated the closer it gets to the viewer. The rocks in the background have more bright reds and oranges that slowly become black and gray and desaturated as they move towards the foreground. The result is a subtle strangeness to this piece. It feels like there's a less distance to the far shore than there really should be. And of course, most artists combine a lot of different techniques to make space in their work. In the foreground figures, the artist emphasizes detail, full value range, and increased saturation to create a coherent sense of space in an otherwise choppy and disjointed composition. This whole image makes sense and doesn't at the same time, but the space is believable. Value, saturation, and detail also combine in this historical painting. Notice the contrast between the figures in the foreground and the buildings through the door. There's a distinct change in saturation, value, and detail in all of those. And one final example. Here space is ambiguous, but that brown-orange shape pushes forward and seems to float in front of the clouds, which are low value contrast. They're desaturated and they have less detail. So in the end, space is a really powerful tool that you can use to increase the area that you're working in. And it is true across all subjects and all levels of abstraction and representation.